We are Risa Limbicki, Angelica Lachance, and Roxandra Nahaichuk, and this is our lesson plan for Multiliteracies for a grade 10 academic history course for a 75-minute period. And it's an introductory unit on the residential school system in Canada. So we begin this lesson plan with an introductory activity that is an anticipation guide. So the teacher would read out statements regarding the residential school system, and students would hold up either a yes or a no paddle, depending on whether or not they think the statement is historically accurate. And then the teacher would give the responses, and we would have a class discussion after. So this activity would introduce the students to the unit on residential schools. Once that activity is finished, after about 10 minutes, we will launch into the main activity, which is the scrapbook. So students will be seated in their desks in groups of 4 to 6, depending on class size. Each group will have a book, and they'll be able to examine it together during the lesson. The lesson focuses on the basic introductory concepts of the unit, so mainly the Indian Act and what led up to the residential school system being implemented in Canada. The benefit of this project is that the students have the physical book. They can pass it back and forth. They can flip pages forward, backwards. They can pause as long as they need to. That's a benefit they don't have with a PowerPoint presentation or a lecture or anything else. And then once we've gone through the Indian Act pages, we would have discussion questions that the class will engage in as a whole. And that activity will take approximately 25 minutes, maybe a little bit longer. After that, we launch into our virtual timeline. So students view the interactive Google timeline on the projector. They take notes on the dates and events. There are YouTube videos embedded in the timeline, and it has key facts and terminology related to residential schools in Canada. And that activity will take approximately 15 minutes. Then the students will start their group timeline activity. So the timeline activity is something they'll be working on in groups throughout the unit. They create their own timeline of what they consider to be the most relevant dates of the residential school system throughout that time period. So they're going to write their dates on chart paper, and during this first instructional period, they'll plot 1 to 2 key dates or events that they learn about. So something during the Indian Act or something leading up to that or after it. And this will be a continued activity throughout. That should take about 10 minutes because they'll only be adding a couple points onto their timelines. After that, they'll be doing a brief writing activity where they respond to an image. So they'll each choose an image from the back of the scrapbook and write a brief 1 to 2 paragraph response to the image. They can write about basically anything, how they feel about the picture, what it makes them think about, why they think it's relevant, or anything else that they find significant. And that'll take another about 10 minutes. So then the culminating activity will just be a quick exit slip, so students have to write down at least one thing they learned about the residential school system, as well as something that they want to learn in subsequent lessons. And that material will just be informally assessed so that the teacher can change and alter the lessons to reflect the students' interests and any questions that they have. So that is the basis of this lesson plan for the residential school system in Canada.
Alright, so we will look at the timeline on a projector and take notes on significant events and dates. The class will look at the virtual timeline in order to get a broad-based picture of the historical events surrounding the residential school system in Canada. The timeline outlines some important dates, starting with the approximate dates of when the residential school system instituted the first residential schools. Afterwards, we will discuss the unpleasant realities of the residential schools and look at the death toll that the system created for Aboriginal children. The unpleasant reality timeline continues, and we will talk about how, statistically speaking, Aboriginal students did not often remain in the school system past grade 6. A brief class discussion will be encouraged so that the students can reflect among their groups about what this could mean for the brutal treatment of Aboriginal students. More facts will be given on the experimentation that was done on these kids and how the historical propaganda stands out in stark relief to the reality of the schools. In contrast, a government propaganda video will be shown to demonstrate the contrast between the expectations of residential schools and the realities of it. Later in the timeline, a short video will be shown to sufficiently illustrate the realities of residential schools as a survivor reflects back on the abuse that he experienced in the residential school system, which gives relevant information about why compensation was so necessary. At the end of the timeline, we will track the apologies from various institutions that came forward to acknowledge the way that the residential school system treated Aboriginals, followed by a brief discussion about the legal compensation that is now available to anyone who can prove that they went through the residential school system. The timeline will be wrapped up with information about what is currently happening in direct response to the residential school experience. The timeline ends with a reflective video on the legacy of the residential school system.
Our scrapbook opens up with background information to the 1876 Indian Act. Some of the topics covered regarding the Indian Act include an introduction, its origins, the potlatch law, the white paper policy, and gender discrimination. Each page pertaining to the Indian Act includes definitions to key vocabulary that students may not be familiar with, including Indian status, reserves, enfranchisement, and potlatches. The pages of the Indian Act are also aged to reflect the historical period from which this act originated. This also introduces the element of texture to the scrapbook, allowing students to become engaged in the historical document. Most of the remaining pages are not aged, and this allows students to see the contrast between the old origins of the Indian Act and the residential school system that came from it, and its modern relevance as apologies and compensation are still being addressed today. As we transition to other topics in the book, we first address, on its own page, whether or not the Indian Act should be abolished. This page gives key information about the Indian Act and will allow students to have a discussion on their personal beliefs about whether or not this act should be abolished. Additionally, we include a page with key dates ranging from 1885 to 2013 that give a brief overview of the major amendments made to the Indian Act. From there, we move into the residential school system. We begin with a page with brief facts and stats about the residential school system that set the stage for the more detailed information that students will receive in the following pages. At that point, students can turn to the living conditions of residential schools, where they will learn in more detail what the students in the system had to experience. From there, students will have the opportunity to read 3 case profiles about 3 different schools that existed in the system. The first one is aged to reflect its early origins, opening in 1889 and early closing in 1949. The second and third profiles are not aged to reflect their modern relevance. After the case studies, students will read an article that begins to address the atrocities of the residential school system that have been uncovered. This article will function as a discussion piece, but also as a transition into more modern parts of the scrapbook. After the article, the scrapbook closes with a series of quotations and images that students can use for group discussions, classroom assignments, or personal reflection.
So this is a multiliteracy teaching tool. So we have incorporated different types of literacies into the project. There is a written component, the textual pieces of the scrapbook. There is a visual component in the fact that there are images in the scrapbook, and there are also images and videos on the digital timeline. There is an oral piece because it will accompany a class discussion and mini lecture. And there's oral in the timeline itself, the videos that are embedded in it. There's a technological aspect with the timeline itself and the fact that it's viewed on a computer and projector. And there's the element of texture and the fact that students are physically able to hold the scrapbooks, touch the pages, move them around, and manipulate them to their own pace and learning needs. So that is how we have done our introduction to the unit on the residential schools in Canada for a history class.